Okay, so you're back with us for another deep dive. And today we're tackling something that's probably causing a lot of you some head scratching.
Yeah, a lot of buzz around this one.
Exactly. We're talking about the Forged Act, specifically Section 301, and how it's basically going to totally revamp this thing called Milestone A.
Right. And if you're in defense acquisition, this is something you really need to get a handle on because it's going to change how a lot of things work.
Think of this episode as like your cheat sheet to navigating this whole change, not just what's on paper, but like how it's going to actually play out.
Exactly. We're going to dig into the recommendations we've got from this analysis called Streamlining Defense Acquisition, Section 301 analysis, and really break down the essentials, like what it means, why they're doing it, and what you need to do to get ready.
So for this deep dive, our goal is super clear. We want to understand this whole Milestone A recommendation, how it's actually going to be implemented, and give you a heads up on what you might need to do to prepare.
Sounds good.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is Milestone A, and why are they making such a big deal about changing it with this Section 301?
So Milestone A, if we go back to our source material, was officially established in 2001 by the National Defense Authorization Act.
Okay.
And the whole point of it was to make sure that when you're making these really important decisions early on in defense acquisition, they're based on some serious and early assessments.
So like a big go, no-go decision point.
Yeah, exactly, a checkpoint. But here's the thing. Over time, some problems started to pop up.
Okay, so what were the main issues people were having with it?
Well, the GAO Government Accountability Office, they put out reports. There were analyses from discover.diadic.mil, all saying that Milestone A had become too rigid, It was actually slowing down innovation by forcing people to make firm decisions and have all this mature data super early in the game, when realistically you just don't have that kind of info yet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then you've got the defense.gov histories also showing how this was making it take way longer to get new capabilities out in the field. So the whole thing that was supposed to be this, cautious safeguard was kind of backfiring and actually causing delays.
Yeah, like the initial attempt to be super careful ended up creating a bottleneck.
Right, exactly.
So that brings us to Section 301 of S.5618, which came out in December 2024.
Right.
This was like the legislative answer to all these issues, right?
Absolutely. Section 301 goes right at those long-standing concerns. They took what they learned from innovation.defense.gov and listened to those GAO recommendations for more flexibility. And what they did was completely get rid of that pre-Milestone A determination requirement. They also removed Section 4251, which was a big part of the old acquisition framework.
Okay.
The whole idea is to clear out those early bureaucratic hurdles. The bottom line is that you might see these new technologies moving from concept to those initial stages a lot faster.
Okay, so it's less about all that upfront analysis and more about streamlining those early phases. So what are the good things that are supposed to come out of this?
Well, the analysis says there are a few key things we should see happen. First off, the whole acquisition timeline is supposed to speed up because they're removing those pre-Milestone A determinations. This means programs can get off the ground and move forward more quickly.
Yeah, less bureaucracy, quicker start. Makes sense.
What else? Second, they expect a big drop in the overall paperwork and administrative burden.
Okay.
The idea is to free up people and resources so the acquisition teams can spend more time actually developing things instead of being buried in documents in the early stages.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And how's this whole change going to affect the money side of things?
The third thing they're aiming for is a change in how they handle cost estimates. So instead of doing all that cost stuff super early, they're going to focus those efforts on the later stages of a program when they've got more solid data to work with.
So they're basically saying, wait till we have a clearer picture before we get too deep into the numbers.
Right, exactly. The estimates will be based on real progress instead of just early guesses.
Okay, I see. Now, what about CAPE E, the Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office, the Pentagon's kind of internal think tank for costs? How are they going to be affected by this?
Well, Section 301 is also looking to redefine how CAPE's involved. They want to get rid of what some people saw as unnecessary oversight during those very early milestones and basically simplify the review process.
Okay, so less redundancy. And the last benefit we talked about was all about boosting innovation.
Yeah, exactly. By lowering those initial barriers, they hope to see more innovation and faster prototyping of all those new technologies.
Okay, so it sounds like they're trying to make the whole system more efficient and innovative, but I know our analysis also brought up some possible downsides. What are some of the risks we should be watching out for?
That's a really important point. Efficiency is great, but there are always some potential downsides. One of the big worries is that with less oversight early on, they might end up approving programs that aren't really going to work, which would be a waste of resources in the long run. Remember, that initial rigor was there for a reason.
Right, it was like a filter to weed out the bad ideas. What other problems could we run into?
Another thing is that even though the cost estimates might be more accurate later on because they're waiting, the downside is that some big risks might be missed in those early phases. And that could mean that potential cost overruns don't get noticed until much later, when they're much harder and more expensive to fix.
Yeah, it's always cheaper to catch problems early on. Now, what about SAPI having less involvement early on? Is that always a good thing?
Well, maybe not. The analysis suggests that without SAPI looking things over early on, there might be less focus on keeping costs under control, which could lead to those cost overruns we were just talking about. Having them involved early can be a good way to keep things in check.
Right, like a second set of eyes.
Yeah.
And how's this faster pace going to affect the people actually working on acquisitions?
Yeah, there's a chance that if a lot of programs start moving really fast through those early phases, it could put a lot of strain on the acquisition staff.
Okay.
If they're suddenly trying to handle a bunch of programs all moving at once, it could overload them and lead to mistakes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last but not least, are we going to be sure that all these fast-tracked programs are actually lining up with the bigger strategic goals?
Right. That's another potential pitfall. If they skip some of those initial checks, they might end up with programs that aren't really supporting the overall strategic needs.
So some definite areas to watch out for. But the analysis also talked about some ways to minimize these risks, some proactive steps, right? What are some of the key things they're planning to do?
Yeah, they've got a few mitigation strategies in mind. One of the big ones is to have really thorough risk reviews done by both the GROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and the PEOB, the Program Executive Officer Board. These reviews are meant to act as a new kind of early filter to catch and potentially kill off any programs that don't look like they're going to pan out.
So kind of like a new way of doing that early screening. What else are they going to do?
They're also going to require preliminary cost screenings before they make any major commitments to a program. That way they'll at least have some idea of the financial picture early on.
Okay, and they're not cutting CHAPI out of the early stages entirely, are they?
Nope, not completely. For decisions that seem really risky, SAP will still be there to give advice, so their expertise will be available when it's most needed.
Okay, good. And what about helping the acquisition staff handle the potential overload? How are they going to get ready for this faster pace?
They're going to provide specific training to the acquisition staff on how to work with these accelerated processes. That should help them manage the faster pace and the increased workload.
Okay, makes sense. And to make sure things stay aligned with the strategic goals.
All programs will still have to meet those established capstone requirements to ensure they're contributing to the overall strategy.
Okay, so that gives us a much better picture of what's changing and how they're trying to minimize the risks. So for someone out there listening who's actually working in defense acquisition, who's going to be most affected by these changes and what should they be doing to get ready?
The analysis specifically points to a few key groups who are going to feel the biggest impact. First, the acquisition program managers. They're going to have to adapt to these faster timelines, less formal oversight in the beginning, and a shift in focus toward those later stages of a program.
Okay.
They need to really understand these new risk review processes and be ready for a possible increase in workload as programs move through more quickly. The big thing for program managers is to be ready to move fast, but also keep a really close eye on things as the programs develop.
So they need to be flexible and proactive about managing those evolving risks. Who else needs to pay attention?
KPT staff are going to see some pretty big changes too. With less to do before Milestone A, they'll probably need to focus their efforts elsewhere. They might want to concentrate on becoming experts in those later stage cost analysis methods and maybe refine their review processes to match the new way acquisitions are going to flow. The main takeaway for KP is that their workload might shift from those early assessments to more in-depth analysis once programs are more mature.
Okay, and are there any other key players who need to be in the loop and prepare?
Yeah, the military department secretaries, they're going to be in charge of overseeing these streamlined approval processes. They'll have to adjust their risk management approaches to account for the changes in early oversight and be prepared to deal with any areas where risks might be higher later on. For them, the key is to understand this new balance of oversight and figure out where they might need to be extra vigilant.
It's also worth noting that whenever you make big changes like this, there can be some pushback. Based on the analysis, who might object to this recommendation and why?
Well, The analysis mentions a few potential sources of opposition, like we talked about. KP analysts might not be thrilled about it because they really see early cost oversight as crucial to avoiding cost overruns later on. So their resistance would come from their belief in the importance of that early financial scrutiny.
Yeah, which makes sense given their role. Who else might have reservations?
The service branches themselves might also have some objections. Their worry could be that rushing these programs through might lead to overlooking some specific needs or requirements that are important to their particular branch.
Okay, so wanting to make sure new acquisitions are actually going to meet their operational needs.
Exactly. And then there's the congressional overseers, the ones who control the budget.
Right.
They might also have some concerns.
And why is that?
Well, if you take away some of those traditional Milestone A checks, it could reduce transparency in those early funding decisions. And they might want to keep that visibility and accountability when it comes to how defense money is being spent early on. So it's really important to be aware of these different viewpoints to make sure the implementation and communication goes smoothly.
So to make this whole shift work, it's going to take some resources, right? What does the analysis say about what we'll need?
The analysis really emphasizes that the DoD is going to need dedicated funding for a few important things.
Okay, like what specifically?
They need to invest in the tools and processes for those risk reviews, provide thorough training for the acquisition workforce on these new, faster procedures. And they might even need to bring in more cost analysts to handle the extra work that's expected in those later program phases. So that gives you an idea of how much investment it's going to take to support this transition.
And how are they going to know if these changes are actually working? What are they going to measure to see if it's successful?
The analysis outlines some specific metrics that they'll use to evaluate how well Section 301 is being implemented. They're aiming for a 20% reduction in pre-Milestone A. Timelines. They want to keep early phase cancellation rates under 10%, and they want to see those cost estimates in the later phases be at least 90% accurate. And importantly, they're going to track these metrics every year to see how things are going and make adjustments if needed.
Yeah, it's always good to have clear goals. Now, did they consider any other ideas when they were putting together Section 301 that they didn't end up using?
Yeah, they actually mentioned a couple of alternative approaches.
Oh, okay, like what?
One idea was to keep a simplified milestone DAFE, a checklist, as a way to balance the need for speed with some level of oversight. And they also thought about developing some kind of digital risk dashboard, which might have been inspired by things from innovation.defense.gov. This could have been a way to streamline those early assessments without getting rid of the existing framework altogether.
It's interesting to see that they explored different options. So to sum it all up for our listeners, what's the main takeaway about Section 301 and how it's going to impact Milestone A, especially when it comes to implementing it and getting ready for it?
Basically, Section 301 of the Forged Act is a major attempt to speed up defense acquisitions by making those early stages before Milestone A lot more streamlined.
Yeah.
The goal is to create a faster and more efficient path for getting new technologies developed. But to make it work, they need to be really careful about managing risk, effectively implement those mitigation strategies we talked about, and make sure the whole acquisition workforce is prepared for the changes in oversight.
Exactly. And for you listening, whether you're deep in the weeds of defense acquisition or just keeping an eye on things, understanding this change is really important. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a good foundation of what's happening, why it's happening, and most importantly, how you might need to prepare for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you think about all these changes, we want to leave you with one final thought to consider. Given that they're trying to accelerate defense acquisition, and there are those potential risks from having less oversight early on, how do you think these changes to the very beginning of the process are going to reshape defense innovation in the long run? It's a pretty big question that's worth exploring and thinking about the broader strategic implications.
Definitely something to ponder. All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll catch you next time.